He had been born in Moffat, in the Scottish Borders, on the 24th of April, 1882. His father was the headmaster of a small private preparatory school. Hugh was a quiet, serious, slightly awkward boy who preferred mathematics to games and was bullied for both. He passed into the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich at 18 and was commissioned into the Royal Garrison Artillery a year later. He served in Asia for most of the next decade: Gibraltar, Hong Kong, Ceylon, the northwest frontier, and developed slowly two reputations. The first was for unusual technical aptitude. He understood ballistics, mathematics, and emerging communication technologies better than any officer of his age in the artillery. The second was for an awkwardness in conversation that bordered on rudeness. He did not, by his own admission, understand small talk. He gave officers under his command exact, clear instructions. He gave officers above him exact, clear assessments, including, on many occasions, exact, clear assessments of their mistakes. The senior officers called him Stuffy. The nickname stuck for the rest of his life. In 1913, at the age of 31, he became fascinated by aviation and paid for his own pilot's license at the Vickers School at Brooklands. The next year, when the First World War began, he transferred to the Royal Flying Corps. He commanded a squadron at the Somme. He commanded a wing on the Western Front. He survived the war as a brigadier general. He was widely respected by the pilots under his command for what they described as his cold, exact patience in the planning of air operations. By 1933, he was the air member for supply and research on the Air Council, effectively, the senior officer of the Royal Air Force in charge of equipment, technology, and development. In that role, he made two decisions that would, in retrospect, win the Battle of Britain. The first decision was about the next generation of British fighter aircraft. In 1934, the standard frontline British fighter was a biplane called the Gloucester Gauntlet, open cockpit, fixed undercarriage, 2 machine guns, top speed 230 miles per hour. The Air Ministry had been planning to replace it with a slightly more modern biplane. Dowding refused. He wrote, in a memo so technically detailed that Air Ministry colleagues complained they could not follow it, that the next British fighter must be a monoplane, must have 8 machine guns, must have an enclosed cockpit with a retractable undercarriage, and must be capable of 300 miles per hour. He commissioned the specification himself. He fought the Treasury for the funds. He overruled colleagues who thought the requirement was unrealistic. The two aircraft that resulted from his specification were the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. Both flew their prototype tests in 1935. Both were in frontline service by 1939. Together, they constituted the entire effective strength of Royal Air Force Fighter Command at the start of the Battle of Britain. Without them, there would have been no battle. The second decision was about radar. Radar, in the mid-1930s, was an experimental technology. The British physicist Robert Watson-Watt had demonstrated in February 1935 that a transmitted radio pulse, reflected off a metal object in the air, could be detected at a distance of 8 miles. By 1936, his team at Bawdsey Manor in Suffolk had pushed the range to 75 miles. The technology was promising but unproven. Most senior officers in the Royal Air Force regarded it as a scientific curiosity. Dowding regarded it as the only practical answer to the air defense of Britain. He wrote, again in technically detailed memos that his colleagues found exhausting, that radar would allow the Royal Air Force to detect incoming German aircraft 50 miles offshore, calculate their course, predict their target, and dispatch fighters to intercept them before they crossed the coast. Without radar, he wrote, the air defense of Britain was impossible. There were not enough fighters to maintain standing patrols, and any sudden German raid would be over English soil before British aircraft could climb to meet it. He demanded a chain of radar stations along the entire east and south coast of Britain. He demanded the construction of a network of operations rooms to process the data. He demanded the construction of underground bunkers to house the operations rooms. He demanded the training of thousands of plotters, controllers, and observers. He got everything he asked for. By July 1939, 2 months before the war began, the chain-home radar network was operational from the Orkneys to the Isle of Wight. It was the only fully integrated air defense radar system in the world. The Germans, when they began the Battle of Britain in July 1940, knew that the radar masts existed. They did not understand what the radar was for. Dowding was given command of Fighter Command in July 1936. He took up the post in a small office at Bentley Priory, a country house at Stanmore in northwest London. He spent the next 4 years building the system that the radar, the fighters, the airfields, the squadrons, the operations rooms, the controllers, the observers, the telephone landlines, and the women plotters would all eventually feed into. The system worked as follows. A German raid, crossing the English Channel, was detected by the chain home radar stations on the south coast. The data, bearing, estimated altitude, estimated number of aircraft, was sent by telephone landline to a filter room at Bentley Priory. The filter room cross-referenced the radar plot with information from the Royal Observer Corps, with intercepted German radio chatter from a secret listening service, and with reports from radar stations along the coast. The filter room produced a consolidated picture of the raid. The consolidated picture was sent to the operations rooms of the 4 fighter command groups, then down to the sector stations, then down to the individual fighter squadrons. A squadron leader, sitting in his dispersal hut next to his Spitfire, received an order to scramble. He climbed into his aircraft. He took off. He climbed to an exact altitude on an exact compass heading. As he climbed, his sector controller continued to talk to him by radio, adjusting his course, adjusting his altitude, telling him exactly where the German formation was, exactly how high it was, exactly when he should expect to see it. The British fighter, when it arrived at the engagement point, was almost always in position to attack. The German bomber crew, looking up to see Spitfires diving on them out of the sun, generally believed that the British had been waiting for them by sheer chance. They did not understand that they had been tracked for an hour, that their course had been predicted, and that the fighters above them had been told exactly where to fly. That, in essence, was what Dowding had built. It is the reason the Battle of Britain is the only battle in military history in which a numerically inferior force defeated a numerically superior force by means of an information network. The battle proper began in July 1940. The Germans, having defeated France and forced the British Expeditionary Force to evacuate from Dunkirk, were preparing to invade England. The invasion required, first, the destruction of the Royal Air Force. The Luftwaffe began with attacks on shipping in the English Channel. They progressed to attacks on coastal radar stations and forward airfields. They escalated in August to attacks on sector stations and aircraft factories. By the end of August, they were destroying fighter command aircraft and pilots faster than the Royal Air Force could replace them. Dowding, throughout this period, remained in his underground operations room at Bentley Priory. He did not give operational orders. He had built his system so that the operational orders were given by the men below him, the group commanders, the sector controllers, the squadron leaders. His job, he had decided years earlier, was to preserve the system itself, to ensure that there were still squadrons in the air a week from now, a month from now, 6 months from now. He did this by carefully husbanding his reserves. He rotated exhausted squadrons out of the front line into quieter sectors in northern England and Scotland. He refused, repeatedly, to commit reserves to defending France in May and June, despite intense pressure from Churchill, a decision that almost certainly preserved the British fighter strength that won the battle 3 months later. He refused, in August, to send fresh squadrons south to replace the exhausted ones in the front line of the battle, insisting instead on rotating squadrons through a quiet sector for rest and recovery. The Germans, by the second week of September, had begun to lose the battle without fully understanding why. Their bomber losses had been heavier than they could sustain. Their fighter losses, while less severe, had reduced their available escort strength. They shifted, on the 7th of September, from attacking RAF airfields to bombing London. The shift relieved the pressure on Fighter Command's sector stations. It allowed Dowding's exhausted squadrons to recover. It allowed the system to keep functioning. On the 15th of September, the Luftwaffe attempted a final mass daylight raid on London. They were intercepted by every squadron that Fighter Command could put in the air. They lost 60 aircraft. They turned back. It was the end of the daylight battle. Hitler postponed the invasion of England on the 17th of September. He never set it back on the calendar. The Battle of Britain was won. Dowding was dismissed from his command on the 24th of November, 1940. The official reason was that he had passed the official retirement age, that he had been kept on past it only as a wartime emergency, and that the strain of the battle had visibly aged him. The real reason was political. He had made enemies within the Air Council, within the Air Ministry, within Fighter Command itself, by being right about radar, right about monoplanes, right about reserves, and right about France, in each case at the expense of colleagues who had been publicly wrong about those things. His successor in command was Sholto Douglas, an officer who had spent the summer arguing publicly that Dowding's tactics were too cautious. Dowding was offered a position writing a book about the battle. He accepted. The book was suppressed by the Air Ministry on the grounds that some of its technical contents were still classified. It was eventually published in a heavily redacted form in 1942. He retired from the Royal Air Force in 1942 at the age of 60. He lived for another 28 years. He spent his retirement quietly. He was made a baron in 1943, taking the title Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory. He gave occasional lectures. He wrote occasional books, including, late in life, several volumes on his own private religious and philosophical convictions, which were unconventional and which embarrassed the Air Ministry whenever they made the newspapers. He did not give interviews about the Battle of Britain. He did not, by family accounts, like to be reminded of it. He did not attend the dedication of his own statue, which was eventually unveiled outside the Royal Air Force Church of St. Clement Danes in the Strand in 1988. He died on the 15th of February, 1970, at the age of 87. The statue, which faces east toward the City of London, shows him in his Royal Air Force greatcoat, looking, with the same expression his colleagues had described 40 years earlier, neither expectant nor pleased. It is the expression of a man checking that the system is still working. The inscription suggests his characteristic expression. It is also the expression of the man who, in the summer of 1940, sat in an underground operations room in northwest London and watched a battle being won by an information network he had spent 7 years building, without giving a single direct order to a single fighter pilot during any engagement of the campaign. He preferred it that way. If the story stayed with you, there are more like it, quiet planners whose names history forgot but whose decisions kept the lights on. New stories every week on the Untold front. Subscribe to follow the names that history almost forgot. Next time, a different operations room. Patrick Dalzel Job had been an unusual British officer even before the war began. He had been born in 1913. His father, an artillery officer, had been killed at Beaumont Hamel on the Somme in 1916. His mother, refusing to remarry, took her surviving child and moved to Switzerland to live on a war widow's pension. Patrick grew up speaking French and German fluently, attended a Swiss school, and then a Norwegian school after his mother moved north in 1929 to escape rising tensions in Central Europe. By 18, he had become an expert skier. By 19, he was qualified as a yacht master and had sailed solo from Bergen to the Faroe Islands. By 22, he had founded his own tiny shipping company in Norway, running schooners up the coast. He spoke Norwegian like a native and German like an educated Berliner. These were unfashionable qualifications for a young British man in the late 1930s. They became, in 1939, almost uniquely valuable. He joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve at the end of 1938, partly because he suspected war was inevitable, partly because his shipping business had stopped paying its bills. He was commissioned as a lieutenant. He requested service with the Royal Naval Patrol Service in the North Atlantic. They put him on a minesweeper. When the Norwegian campaign began in April 1940, the Royal Navy realized that the lieutenant who spoke Norwegian like a native and knew every fjord on the coast was sitting on a minesweeper in Aberdeen. He was reassigned within 48 hours. That was how he came to be at Narvik on the day he refused to follow orders. After Narvik, Dalzel Job's superiors did the only sensible thing with a man like him. They stopped trying to give him orders and started asking him for suggestions instead. He spent 1941 and most of 1942 attached to a unit called the Naval Intelligence Division, in a small office in the Admiralty Building in London. The office reported directly to Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence. Godfrey's personal assistant was an unsmiling, chain-smoking commander in his 30s who had been a Reuters correspondent in Moscow before the war. The assistant's name was Ian Fleming. Fleming and Dalzel Job did not become friends. They worked in the same building. They occasionally drank in the same Admiralty bar. Fleming, by Dalzel Job's later account, was clever, well-dressed, slightly bored, and extremely good at writing memos that other people would act on. Dalzel Job was, by Fleming's later notes to colleagues, the most courageous, professional, and impossible junior officer I have ever met. They orbited each other for 2 years. Then, in late 1943, Fleming proposed a new unit. It would be called 30 Assault Unit. Its mission would be to land with the leading wave of any Allied assault, race ahead of the main force into enemy territory, and seize intelligence material, codebooks, naval cipher machines, radar equipment, U-boat designs before the Germans could destroy it. Fleming designed the unit. He recruited the officers. He needed men who could speak the local language, operate independently behind enemy lines, and fight if they had to. Patrick Dalzel Job was on the list of the first 6. He landed in Normandy on the morning of the 11th of June, 1944, 5 days after D-Day, at the head of a small Royal Marine Intelligence section. The Allied front line had stalled. The Germans were holding Caen. Dalzel Job, riding a captured German motorcycle, slipped through a gap in the German line, ahead of any British armored unit, and entered the village of Douvres-la-Delevrande. He was carrying a Webley revolver, 2 grenades, a hand-drawn map of the German radar station nearby, and a single Royal Marine corporal in the sidecar. He arrived at the radar station to find it abandoned. The Germans had retreated overnight, taking most of the technical equipment with them. Dalzel Job spent 6 hours photographing what remained, identified the model designations of the surviving radar components, and slipped back through the lines to make his report. He repeated this exercise a dozen more times over the next 10 weeks. He took the surrender of a German garrison commander on his own, with no troops behind him, by riding into the village on his motorcycle and informing the commander, in fluent German, that the rest of the Royal Marines were 10 minutes away. They were not. He seized a German naval headquarters at Cherbourg by walking into it with a Sten gun and a lieutenant from the Free French. He recovered an intact TV radar set, one of the most advanced German naval radars, by being the first Allied officer into the German Naval Research Facility at The Hague. In the autumn of 1944, the British High Command finally caught up with what 30 Assault Unit was actually doing, and assigned them to the leading wave of every major Allied advance for the rest of the war. Dalzel Job led, by the end of the war, more than 200 separate operations behind enemy lines. The last of them was in northern Germany in May 1945. The objective in May 1945 was the German Naval Research Facility at Bremerhaven. The facility was believed to contain the only working examples of a new type of German submarine, the Walter boats, the Type XX boats, and the complete design archives for the German Navy's wartime research program. The problem was that Bremerhaven was in what was about to become the Russian zone of occupation. The Russians were also racing for it. Dalzel Job took a section of Royal Marines and a borrowed Bedford lorry, and drove north through what was left of the disintegrating German army. He passed through 3 German-held villages without firing a shot, accepting their surrenders on the strength of his fluent German and his assertion that British armored columns were directly behind him. He entered Bremerhaven on the morning of the 3rd of May, 1945, 5 days before the official end of the war in Europe. He found the Naval Research Facility largely intact. He arrested the senior German naval officers on the premises. He sealed the technical archives. He stationed Royal Marine sentries at every entrance. He held the facility for 36 hours with a handful of Marines, against the diplomatic objections of a Russian liaison officer who arrived at the gate on a captured German motorcycle and demanded to be let in. Dalzel Job, by his own account, was polite. He invited the Russian officer to take tea in the German admiral's office. He pointed out that the British Royal Marines were holding the building, and that the Russian officer was welcome to wait outside until the formal allocation of occupation zones had been settled in Berlin. The Russian officer waited. By the time formal arrangements were made, and Bremerhaven was confirmed as a British zone, the British Technical Intelligence Team had photographed, catalogued, and partially dismantled the entire German submarine research archive. The submarines that the Royal Navy seized that week became the basis of NATO submarine development for the next 30 years. Patrick Dalzel Job retired from the Royal Navy in 1947, at the rank of commander. He was 34 years old. He held the Distinguished Service Order, 3 mentions in dispatches, and the Norwegian Knight Cross with sword. He had been shot at on every front of the European war except Italy. He had been parachuted, landed, sailed, motorbiked, and walked into 7 occupied countries. He had operated behind enemy lines for an estimated 400 days in total. He moved with his Norwegian wife to a small white cottage in the Highlands of Scotland, a place called Plockton, on the western coast looking toward Skye. He worked, for the rest of his life, as a small boat skipper, ferrying passengers and supplies between the islands. He raised 3 sons. He went to the parish church every Sunday. He answered no journalists' questions. In 1952, Ian Fleming published Casino Royale. The novel's protagonist was a Royal Navy commander, fluent in several European languages, comfortable behind enemy lines, attached to the Naval Intelligence Division, and capable of operating with almost no regard for the orders he had been given. The character's name was James Bond. When the books became famous, journalists began trying to identify the real-life model. There were several candidates. Fleming himself had served in naval intelligence, and the director he had worked for, Admiral Godfrey, was widely thought to be the model for M. Bond's superior. The novelist Christopher Creighton claimed to be Bond. The wartime intelligence officer Wilfred Dunderdale claimed to be Bond. Sidney Riley, the World War I spy, was claimed by his biographers to be Bond. Patrick Dalzel Job, when asked, said he did not know. He pointed out in a letter to one journalist, never read any of Mr. Fleming's books. He said, never met Mr. Fleming for more than a few minutes at a time in the corridors of the Admiralty. He had no opinion about the matter. He preferred not to be interviewed. He died in 2003, at the age of 90. He had spent 56 years living in the same small white cottage. He had not, until the end of his life, ever appeared in a newspaper photograph. His memoir, written reluctantly only after extreme pressure from his sons, was published in 1991. It is 60,000 words long. It mentions James Bond only once in the foreword, where Dalzel Job notes politely that he is not Bond, never was Bond, and that the comparison embarrasses him. He was, in fact, not Bond. He was, very probably, simply the man who Fleming had been watching 2 desks away in a London office, while he was working out what kind of man Bond would have to be. If the story stayed with you, there are more like it. Quiet men who did improbable things on their own initiative, then went home and never talked about them. New stories every week on the Untold front. Subscribe to follow the names that history almost forgot. Next time, a different cottage. He was born on a ranch outside Sioux Falls, South Dakota, on the 17th of April, 1915. His father, a Norwegian immigrant farmer, was killed by a downed power line during a storm in 1933. Joe was 17. He inherited a half-failed farm in the middle of the Dust Bowl, a widowed mother, and a younger brother and sister with no obvious means of finishing their education. He worked the farm by day, took classes at Sioux Falls College in the mornings, and saved every dollar that crossed his hand. By 1934, he had taught himself to fly at a small private airfield in Renner, paying for lessons with vegetables and butter. By 1936, he was the local crop dusting pilot. By 1939, he had transferred to the University of South Dakota and was working 3 jobs: gas station attendant, restaurant cook, photographer for the local newspaper, to put himself through his last year of a business degree. He joined the Marine Corps Reserve in 1940. He was 25 years old. He passed the rigorous Marine pilot selection course at Pensacola, Florida, in March 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. He was, the instructors at Pensacola noted in his file, a competent but not exceptional pilot. He was older than most candidates. His reflexes were slightly slower than the teenage cadets next to him. He was awkward on landings. He was, however, almost impossible to fluster. The Marine Corps would later discover that the second of those qualities mattered far more than the first. He was assigned to Marine Fighter Squadron 121 in April 1942. The squadron was based at San Diego, training on Wildcats for eventual deployment to the Pacific. The Pacific War was not going well. The Japanese had taken Singapore. They had taken the Philippines. They had taken the Dutch East Indies. They were preparing to take Australia. The Marines turned the tide in August 1942, on a small jungle island in the Solomons called Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division landed and took an unfinished Japanese airstrip on the 7th of August. They renamed it Henderson Field, after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. They held it for the next 6 months against repeated Japanese naval bombardments, infantry counterattacks, and night air raids. To hold an airstrip, you need aircraft. The aircraft on Guadalcanal, operating from a single muddy runway perpetually under attack with no spare parts, no fresh food, no proper maintenance hangars, and no functional radar, were known to the Marines who flew them as the Cactus Air Force. Cactus was the Allied code name for Guadalcanal itself. Joe Foss arrived at Henderson Field on the 9th of October, 1942, as executive officer of VMF 121. He flew his first combat mission 4 days later. He nearly died on it. His first combat patrol was a routine intercept. 8 Wildcats climbing to meet a reported flight of Japanese Mitsubishi G4M bombers. The bombers had a fighter escort of 15 Zeros. The Zeros, as Foss climbed toward them with the sun behind him, dove on him from above. A Zero put a 30mm cannon shell through his oil cooler. The Wildcat lost power immediately. Foss put it into a vertical dive, the only way a Wildcat could shake a Zero, and at the bottom of the dive pulled out at 100 meters above the jungle with no oil pressure, a windscreen covered in engine fluid, and 3 Zeros still chasing him. He made it back to Henderson Field on a dead engine. The Wildcat landed hard, skidded off the runway, and stopped against a coconut tree. The maintenance crew counted 200 bullet holes in the airframe. Foss climbed out of the cockpit. He walked over to the maintenance tent. He drank a canteen of water. He asked when the next aircraft would be available. He was airborne again within the hour, in a different Wildcat. That afternoon, he shot down a Zero. Over the next 13 days, he shot down 16 more. His method was distinctive among Marine pilots of the Pacific. He was not, he later said, a man who tried to outfly the Zero. The Zero was faster than the Wildcat, more maneuverable, capable of climbing twice as fast. To dogfight a Zero in a Wildcat was, in Foss's words, a fast way to get dead. What he did instead was use what the Wildcat had, rugged construction, 650 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings, and a tactic the squadron called the Thatch Weave, in which pairs of Wildcats crossed each other's flight paths so that any Zero diving on one Wildcat would be in the other Wildcat's gun sight a few seconds later. Foss flew the lead position in this formation. He drew the Zeros down on him. He flew straight, almost provocatively, baiting the Japanese pilots to commit. When they did, his wingman, crossing behind him at the bottom of the weave, opened fire. It was, as a tactic, ruthlessly simple. It depended on absolute trust between the two pilots, perfect timing, and the willingness of the lead Foss to fly with a Zero pulling into his 6 o'clock position and not break, not turn, not flinch until the wingman called the shot. He did this for 63 consecutive combat missions. By the 25th of October, after 2 weeks at Henderson, he had 19 confirmed kills. He had also been shot down 3 times. The 3rd time he was shot down, he ditched his Wildcat in the ocean off the Florida Islands, north of Guadalcanal. He spent 4 hours in the water in his Mae West life jacket, watching for sharks, before being picked up by Solomon Islanders in an outrigger canoe. The Islanders took him to a small Anglican mission on Malaita Island. The Anglican priest, a New Zealander, gave him dry clothes, a glass of warm water, and an entirely matter-of-fact welcome, as if waterlogged American Marines arrived on his porch every other afternoon. Foss spent 2 days at the mission recovering from exposure. The priest's wife treated his sunburn with coconut oil. On the 3rd day, an Australian coast watcher arranged for a Catalina flying boat to land in the lagoon and ferry Foss back to Guadalcanal. He was back in the air by the end of the week. He had, by this point, lost 10 kilos and developed a persistent fever that the medical officer at Henderson identified as malaria. The medical officer recommended evacuation. Foss declined. Through November and December, Foss and his squadron continued to fly against Japanese air raids that came almost daily. He shot down 9 more aircraft in November. He shot down 7 more in December. He flew on missions in which his squadron was outnumbered 3-1 and lost no aircraft of its own. He flew on missions in which the air raid sirens at Henderson sounded while his Wildcat was still being refueled, and he took off with his engine cowling open and his cockpit canopy halfway closed. By the 15th of January, 1943, his confirmed kill total stood at 26. The number tied the record of Eddie Rickenbacker, the American First World War ace who had been the ranking American pilot for 25 years. A week later, Foss collapsed on the runway with a temperature of 41 degrees. The medical officer this time did not give him a choice. He was flown out of Guadalcanal on a stretcher. He spent the next 4 months in a naval hospital in San Diego. He never returned to combat. He was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Roosevelt on the 18th of May, 1943, in a ceremony at the White House. The citation read, "For outstanding heroism and courage above and beyond the call of duty as Executive Officer of Marine Fighting Squadron 121, 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, at Guadalcanal." He spent the rest of the war touring the United States selling war bonds and recruiting Marine aviators. He was profiled on the cover of Life magazine. He was 31 years old. He returned to South Dakota in 1946. He built a charter aviation company. He served in the South Dakota National Guard. He flew combat in Korea as a colonel. He became the Air National Guard's chief of operations. In 1955, at the age of 40, he was elected governor of South Dakota, the youngest governor in the country at the time. He served 2 terms. He campaigned for civil rights, modernized the state's tax code, and pushed through legislation establishing public health clinics on the reservation lands of the Lakota and Dakota nations. He left politics in 1959. He became the first commissioner of the American Football League, the upstart league that would eventually merge with the NFL. He helped negotiate the merger. He hosted a nationally syndicated outdoor sports television show. He served as president of the National Rifle Association. He died on January 1, 2003, at the age of 87, in Scottsdale, Arizona. The pilot the Marine Corps instructors had described as competent but not exceptional in 1941 had ended the war with 26 confirmed kills, the Medal of Honor, and a record that, for the rest of the 20th century, would be tied by no other Marine aviator. He once said, near the end of his life, that he had not been the best pilot in his squadron. He had simply been the one who refused to leave the airstrip while there was still a runway, and a Wildcat and a Japanese aircraft inbound. He had, he said, only ever done what the men around him would have done if their engines had still been running. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery on the 21st of January 2003. The Marines at the funeral were second generation. Their grandfathers had been the ones who took Henderson Field. The runway is still there. The coral that the steel matting was laid on is still there. The control tower has been rebuilt. The grass no longer burns. But the pilots who held that airstrip in the autumn of 1942, who flew off it 16 days running, with no spare parts and no proper food, are mostly gone now. Joe Foss was the man who held it longest. If the story stayed with you, there are more like it, quiet men who returned to small towns and never said much about what they did. New stories every week on the Untold front. Subscribe to follow the names that history almost forgot. Next time, a different runway. He had been born in Chester in 1917, the son of a barrister. He grew up comfortably, attended Stowe School, then went up to Merton College, Oxford, to read law. He was, by all accounts of his university contemporaries, a witty, unstudious, charming young man who drank more than was wise, gambled at the Bullingdon Club, drove fast cars, and treated his future as something that could be sorted out next month. In 1937, on an undergraduate bet, he made a 1,000-mile drive from England to Berlin in 2.5 days, without an international driving permit, and ate his dinner at a restaurant table next to the deputy head of the Gestapo. He found the Germans, he wrote home, alarmingly serious. The next year he joined the Oxford University Air Squadron, partly because his father had served in the First World War and partly because flying suited the way he liked to live. Fast, slightly reckless, expensive. He was commissioned into the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve in November 1939, 2 months after war had been declared. His first operational squadron was 102 Squadron, flying twin-engined Whitley bombers from RAF Driffield. His first mission was over Germany on the night of the 9th of June, 1940. The Whitley was an underpowered, slow, lumbering machine that took 11 hours to fly to the Ruhr and back. The crews carried thermos flasks of cocoa and morphine syringes in their breast pockets. The casualty rate was 25% per operational tour. Cheshire flew his first tour, then a second, then a third, then a fourth. By the end of the war, he had flown more operational missions than any senior officer in Bomber Command. But the war was not done with him. His career in Bomber Command was unusual because he refused to leave it. After 50 operations, the official end of a tour, most pilots were sent to instructional posts. Cheshire requested extension. After 100 operations, he was widely considered by his superiors to be on borrowed time. He requested extension again. He was promoted, against his will, to wing commander, then to group captain, the youngest in the RAF. He was given command of 76 Squadron, then 617 Squadron, the famous dam busters, who had breached the Möhne and Eder dams in May 1943. By the time he took over, the dam busters had lost so many crews to specialized low-level missions that the squadron was almost having to be rebuilt. Cheshire rebuilt it around a new tactical idea. The standard RAF night bombing technique relied on pathfinders dropping colored flares to mark the target, after which the main bombing force aimed at the flares. The system was inaccurate. Flares drifted in the wind. Crews bombed the wrong side of the city. Civilian casualties were catastrophic. Cheshire began experimenting with low-level marking. Instead of dropping flares from high altitude, he flew in alone at extremely low height, sometimes 200 meters above the target, and dropped a single, brightly burning marker bomb directly on the aiming point. The Lancasters and Halifaxes following 5,000 meters above would then bomb the marker. The technique required exceptional flying. He was diving twin-engine Mosquitoes and four-engine Lancasters into the center of the most heavily defended industrial sites in Europe, flying through anti-aircraft fire that was being aimed specifically at him, then climbing out and waiting overhead while the main force destroyed the target. He did it again and again. The Mailly Tank Depot, the Munich Aero Engine Works, the Limoges Armaments Factory, the Saumur Railway Tunnel. The accuracy of his marking, measured by post-strike reconnaissance photographs, reduced the casualty rate of the main bombing force, increased the destruction of the target, and minimized the spread of bombs into surrounding residential areas. He was awarded the Victoria Cross on the 8th of September 1944. The citation, unusually, was not for a single act of heroism. It was for sustained gallantry over 4 years of continuous operational service. His record of outstanding personal achievement, placing himself invariably in the forefront of the battle, is unsurpassed. The King's Award was the highest in the British system. Cheshire wrote in his diary the day he received the citation, "I have nothing to say about this. I should be ashamed if I did." He was, by then, 26 years old. He completed 103 operational missions. He destroyed targets that the rest of Bomber Command had been failing to hit for 2 years. He kept his own crew alive. Every single member of his personal flight team finished the war. He flew without injury, without crash, without a single time bailing out. He also wrote, in private notebooks during these years, page after page of moral self-examination. He had killed civilians. The marker bombs were precise, but the main bombing force's accuracy was variable, and a town next to a tank factory was a town being bombed regardless of intention. He thought about this constantly. He prayed about it. He was, at this period of his life, an agnostic raised in the Church of England, drifting toward a more serious religious inquiry. In the spring of 1945, he was officially withdrawn from operations and given a staff role at the British military mission in Washington. It was from there, in early August, that he was assigned to fly to the Pacific to observe the use of the new American bombs. He did not, in his official reports, write anything dramatic about Nagasaki. He noted, factually, that the cloud rose to approximately 15,000 meters, that it was visible from 150 kilometers away, and that the fires from the city were still burning 3 days later when the bomber group flew home. In his personal letters, written to his fiancée a few weeks later, he was less factual. He had seen, he wrote, the future of war. He believed that human beings had now been given the power to destroy themselves entirely. He believed that the next time a weapon of this kind was used, it would be used at a scale that ended the species. He believed, in some sentences he later crossed out, that he had personally participated in something that the world would spend the rest of its history trying to put back into the bottle. He returned to England in October 1945. He resigned his commission. He left the Royal Air Force. He did not yet know what he was going to do next. He spent the next 2 years lost. He bought a country house in Hampshire intending to set up a self-sufficient community for former servicemen. The project failed financially. His marriage to his American fiancée collapsed. His health, which had been unaffected by 4 years of combat flying, broke down. He spent 6 months in a sanatorium for tuberculosis. He drifted toward and then away from a number of religious denominations, eventually being received into the Catholic Church at the end of 1948. What pulled him out of this period was a single accident. He had been visiting the Hampshire house, by then sold, when he learned that one of the former residents, an elderly, dying ex-soldier named Arthur Dykes, had nowhere to go. Cheshire took him in personally. He nursed him for 3 months. Arthur Dykes died in Cheshire's care in the autumn of 1948. Almost immediately, news of the act spread, and other people in similar situations began arriving at Cheshire's door. People with cancer, people with multiple sclerosis, veterans of 2 wars with no families left. By the end of 1949, Cheshire was running, with no funding, no medical training, and no clear plan, a small home for the chronically sick and the dying. He called it Lou Court. He named the operation the Cheshire Foundation. He kept opening new houses. By the time of his death in 1992, the Cheshire Foundation operated more than 270 homes in 52 countries, caring for people with disabilities, with terminal illnesses, with no family and no other place to go. He spent the rest of his life, almost without break, fundraising, organizing, recruiting, visiting houses, sleeping in spare rooms at night, writing letters by hand to potential donors in the morning. He became, against his own preference, internationally famous. He received the Order of Merit, the highest civilian honor in Britain, in 1981. He was made a peer in 1991. He died in 1992 of motor neuron disease at the age of 74. The mushroom cloud over Nagasaki, he later told one journalist, had been the last image of his old life and the first image of his new one. He had not yet understood on the flight home what he was going to do. He had only understood that he could not, in good conscience, continue to be the man he had been. The Cheshire Foundation today, 3 decades after his death, still operates in dozens of countries. The houses are still called Cheshire Homes. The people who live in them are mostly not aware that the founder, before he became a man who built homes for the dying, was a man who had broken dams, marked refineries, and watched a city disappear under a single bomb. He preferred it that way. If the story stayed with you, there are more like it, soldiers who came home and built something quieter than the war they survived. New stories every week on the Untold front. Subscribe to follow the lives that turned when the cloud cleared. Next time, a different homecoming. She was born in Schaerbeek, a suburb of Brussels, on the 30th of November, 1916. Her father, Frederick De Jongh, was the headmaster of a small primary school. Her mother was a quiet, devout woman who had raised her 2 daughters on stories of Belgian heroism in the First World War, and especially of one nurse named Edith Cavell, who had been executed by a German firing squad in 1915 for helping British soldiers escape out of Brussels and into the neutral Netherlands. Andree had grown up looking at Cavell's photograph on the wall of her father's study. She had visited the small memorial in Schaerbeek where Cavell's statue stood. She told her sister on more than one occasion that if a war ever came back to Belgium, she would do the same thing. She was small, slight, with short dark hair and the build of a teenage girl. She had trained as a commercial artist and was working in Malmedy when the Germans invaded Belgium in May 1940. The Belgian army surrendered after 18 days. The king was taken into custody. Brussels filled with German uniforms. By June, most of Western Europe was in Nazi hands, and the only way out for anyone, Allied airman, Jewish refugee, escaped prisoner of war, was south across France, across the Pyrenees into neutral Spain or Portugal, and from there to the British consulates that would arrange passage home. The problem was that no such route existed. Andree De Jongh decided to build one. She did not start by herself. There were others. A doctor in Brussels named Albert Garis had begun helping British soldiers escape immediately after Dunkirk. A schoolteacher named Andree De Jongh ran a small operation hiding airmen in Liège. A nurse named Elizabeth Lewis had a circle of safe houses in Mons. Andree joined them as a courier, ferrying false papers and ration cards between cells, learning the geography of resistance. But she had a larger plan. The existing networks ended in Brussels. Beyond that, every escaper had to find his own way south. Most were captured at the demarcation line between occupied and Vichy France, or arrested in Paris, or betrayed at the foot of the Pyrenees. Andree wanted to build a single chain, a continuous line of guides, each handing off to the next, that would take an airman from a safe house in Brussels all the way over the mountains to a British official in Spain, without any single link knowing more than the names of the two people on either side of him. She started with her father. Frédéric De Jongh agreed to coordinate the Brussels end. She started recruiting Belgian friends, students, parish priests, bicycle messengers, postal workers, the wives of men in the Belgian army now sitting in German prison camps. She found families in northern France willing to hide airmen in their attics. She made contact with a Basque smuggler named Florentino Goicoechea, a powerful, illiterate, gentle giant of a man who had been smuggling goods across the Pyrenees for 20 years and knew every shepherd's hut between Saint-Jean-de-Luz and the Spanish border. By the spring of 1941, the line was working. They called it the Comet Network, the Comet Line, because the airmen passed through it so quickly. Andree walked the first 3 groups herself. Then she walked the next 20. Then the next 50. But somebody else was also paying attention. The Gestapo did not at first realize that the Comet Line existed as a single organization. They saw isolated escapes. An airman picked up by the resistance in one town and then vanishing. A British officer reported missing from a French prison camp. A scattering of arrests of Belgian civilians who, under interrogation, knew very little. But by 1942 the pattern had emerged. The Germans understood that someone was running a high-volume escape route from Brussels to the Spanish border. They began assigning agents to penetrate it. Andree, by this point, was making the journey personally about once a month. From Brussels by train to Paris, where her father would meet the airmen and hand them off. From Paris by train to the small towns near the Pyrenean foothills. From there by bicycle to a farmhouse owned by a woman called Tante Go, Aunt Go, real name Elvire de Grief, a Belgian woman married to a Frenchman who had set up shop in Anglet. From Tante Go's on foot by night, across the Bidasoa River and over the mountains, guided by Florentino. The route covered 700 kilometers. The airmen, most of them tall, blonde, English-speaking, with their flying boots changed for civilian shoes that did not fit and their wedding rings sewn into the linings of their coats, were drilled in the basics of being a Belgian or French civilian. They were told not to talk. They were told not to look up. They were told that if questioned by a German, they must point to their throats and indicate that they were mute. They were told that if they were caught, they would be sent to a prisoner of war camp. They were told that everybody else along the line, Andree, the safe house family, Florentino, would be shot. Most of them got through. Some did not. Each time Andree returned to Brussels, the network had lost another person. By the autumn of 1942, she had taken at least 18 groups across the Pyrenees in person, roughly 120 men. She was 26 years old. She had not slept a full night in months. She had walked tens of thousands of kilometers. She had survived a German checkpoint by hiding under a haystack with 2 Royal Air Force pilots while a Gestapo officer questioned the farmer for 40 minutes, 3 meters away from her head. On the night of 15th of January 1943, she was waiting in a farmhouse in Arugn, near the Spanish border, with 3 British airmen and Florentino. They had walked from Paris and were due to cross the mountains the next night. The farmhouse was owned by a woman named Francia Uzendazaga, a Basque farmer's widow who had hidden dozens of airmen in her hayloft. There was a knock at the door before dawn. A boy in the village had been arrested the day before. He had broken under interrogation. He had named the farmhouse. The Gestapo took everyone inside. Florentino, by some miracle, was sleeping in the barn. The German officers did not search it. The airmen were taken first to a French prison, then to Germany. They survived the war. Andree and Francia were taken to a Gestapo holding cell in Bayonne. The interrogation lasted 6 months. The Gestapo did not believe, at first, that the small, calm young woman in front of them was the head of the Comet Line. They had been imagining a man or a network of men. They asked her again and again about her superiors, about who was really running the operation. Andree, to throw them off her father, did something very specific. She told them the truth. She said plainly and repeatedly that she had organized the network, that she had recruited the cell leaders, that her father in Brussels was merely a courier, not the chief, that all the major operational decisions had been made by her. The Gestapo did not believe her. They could not. They returned to the idea of a male superior. They beat her, drugged her, deprived her of sleep, threatened her with execution. Each time, Andree gave the same story. Each time, the Gestapo concluded she was lying to protect her father. What she was actually doing, by claiming all the responsibility, was buying her father time to escape. Leonard De Jongh had been warned by another cell as soon as the Arugn arrests happened. He should have gone underground in Brussels and waited out the war. He did not. He continued to run the Paris end of the network for another 6 months. In June 1943, he was finally betrayed. The Gestapo arrested him at the Café Madeleine in Paris. He was tortured. He gave no useful information. He was executed at Mont-Valérien in March 1944. Andree, in her German prison cell, did not learn of his death until after the war. She survived the camps by accident. The Gestapo, still not believing that the small Belgian woman was the head of the line, kept her in interrogation longer than they would have kept a male prisoner. By the time they finally gave up and sent her to Ravensbrück in the winter of 1943, she was already a famous prisoner, known to other inmates by name, watched by the SS, which paradoxically meant she was harder to disappear. She was moved between camps, Ravensbrück, then Mauthausen, then back to Ravensbrück. She was force-marched twice. She was put on starvation rations. She survived on potato peelings and the warmth of other prisoners. She was liberated by Allied troops at Mauthausen on April 22, 1945. She weighed 36 kilos. She returned to Brussels alone. Her father was dead. Her mother had died of grief while she was in the camps. Her sister had been arrested. The network was gone. She had been the principal architect of one of the largest escape operations of the war. 800 and more Allied airmen and soldiers had been brought to safety along the Comet Line. She had personally walked an estimated 118 of them across the Pyrenees. She received the George Medal from King George VI of Britain, the United States Medal of Freedom from President Truman, the Order of the British Empire, and the highest French and Belgian decorations. She refused to give a single interview about what she had done. When asked why, late in life, she told a friend that the people who deserved credit had not survived. She did not retire. She spent the next 48 years working in leper colonies in Belgian Congo, Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Senegal. She nursed patients no one else would touch. She built clinics. She trained local staff. She lived in conditions almost as harsh as the camps she had survived. She made no public statements about her past. The leper patients in Senegal, who knew her as Sister Andree, mostly did not know she had been awarded the OBE. She came home to Brussels in the late 1980s when her health failed. She lived quietly in a small apartment until her death on October 13, 2007, at the age of 90. The Belgian government held a state funeral. The Royal Air Force sent representatives. 800 airmen had been brought home by a young woman who, in 1941, had walked into the British consulate in San Sebastian and been mistaken for a spy. The British attaché who had nearly turned her away on that first day later wrote, in his memoir, "She was the bravest person I ever met. I almost did not let her come back in." If the story stayed with you, there are more like it. Quiet people who walk thousands of miles to bring other people's children home. New stories every week on the Untold front. Subscribe to follow the names that history almost forgot. Next time we walk a different line.